Thank you all for joining us for our SICSS-Howard Mathematica Funded Alumni Research in Progress Roundtable. During these Real Talk Roundtables, our hosting organizations, Howard, Mathematica, and SICSS, discuss the experiences of people of color within their institutions or offer tips and tricks for success. In the case of our SICSS panel today, teams who receive SICSS-Howard Mathematica Excellence in Computational Social Science Research Awards will be presenting their research projects in progress. They are PhD students, early career faculty, and postdocs who attended SICSS-Howard Mathematica site and were successful in getting funding. They are currently where you want to be. I would recommend you learn about their projects, listen to their trajectory, and ask them questions so you can create a project that gets you funding this year from us and also throughout your career. Participants at the SICSS-Howard Mathematica site will have a chance to ask questions about their projects and get to know them during the second day of Praxis to Power. For now, I encourage you to settle in, listen, and learn.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Grace Flores-Robles, and I'm a fourth-year PhD student at the City University of New York Graduate Center in Psychology. I'm also a SICSS-Howard Mathematica 22 alum, and my project today, or my research proposal, titled, "When Do People See and Sanction Systemic Injustice? A Computational Experimental Approach to Social Problems." Now, as with all research, I had some difficulties, and so I didn't actually get through the computational component. So I will be focusing mostly on the experiment for the sake of this presentation. So before I get into my actual proposal, I do want to introduce myself a little bit before and after SICSS. So coming into SICSS, I was a third-year PhD student. And this research proposal actually set the foundation for what is going to be my dissertation. So I'm really, really grateful for SICSS in helping me collect the data that I need for my dissertation. So the idea for this project actually emerged before I joined SICSS, but again, it was really instrumental in helping get the data. So to start, I'm sure many of you know who this is. This is Simone Biles. And in 2015, it was revealed that Larry Nassar, a team doctor to the US national gymnastics team, had been abusing the gymnast, including Simone Biles, for decades. At a testimony regarding the abuse, Simone Biles claimed, "To be clear, I blame Larry Nassar, but I also blame an entire system that enabled and perpetuated his abuse." So what Simone Biles is really hinting at here is that there are two ways that we can think about social problems. We can think about them at the individual level, in which an individual is the direct cause of the harm. In this case, Larry Nassar is the direct cause of harm. And blame and punishment at this level is relatively easy because whoever is the direct cause of the harm is the one who is to blame and also punished. But we can also think about social problems at a more systemic level. In this case, it would be something like a widespread culture of abuse in gymnastics that kind of facilitated Larry Nassar's abuse. But thinking about blame and punishment at the systemic level is a lot more complicated. Who would you actually blame or punish when a whole system is at fault? Would it be something like the National Gymnastics Association, the FBI, who mishandled the allegations, coaches, society? So as I've already mentioned, there are two ways that we can think about social problems. The first is the individual level, which I will be referring to as a bad apple moving forward. A bad apple in this research is a small number of people who are responsible for the vast majority of injustice that occurs. So for example, in this case, we have two individuals who are responsible for injustice out of a majority. And when we're thinking about things in terms of a system, I'm going to be referring to it as a bad climate, which are multiple people who are responsible for the injustice that occurs. This can be anything like organizations or institutions or even perverse incentive structures that kind of facilitate injustice. So as we can see in this image, we have a lot more people who are engaged in the injustice. And the way that we start to think about the source of these injustices is really important for how we start thinking about policy solutions. If we're thinking of things in terms of bad apples, we might think that punishing individuals is the best approach. And we see this in the way that our criminal justice system is set up. But when we're thinking about things in terms of a bad climate, we might want to change the rules and incentives of an entire system, which is a little bit more complicated. So that's kind of the theory I was thinking of, or the background that came into this project. But for the sake of this proposal, I decided to be a little bit more general. So in this research specifically, I was interested in how people ascribe responsibility and subsequently punish injustice that occurs as the result of a bad apple, which again is a corrupt person in a group, or a bad climate, which is more of a corrupt system. And I decided to move away from sexual assault and instead used a more broad design that kind of got at multiple types of injustice. So to explore this question, I used an economic game, which allowed us to separate people's thinking about structural unfairness from their pre-existing ideas about society, and it allowed us to measure punishment behavior as opposed to self-report. I hypothesized that participants would be more willing to punish individuals when they saw unfairness as the result of a bad apple, and I thought that they would be more willing to change the rules of an unfair game when they saw that it was the result of the nature of the game itself, or a more systemic problem. So again, I used an economic game. Specifically, I modified the ultimatum game, in which there is an allocator who is given a sum of money, who then has to share it with the receiver, who is entirely passive and has no say in it. Both the allocator and the receiver were pre-programmed in this game setup so that the participant was the only real person. And after the game began, the observer saw multiple rounds of unfair offers. The participant was assigned to the role of the observer. And so they either saw unfairness as the result of a bad apple, in which case there was one allocator being really, really unfair, and there were two fair allocators, or they saw a bad climate, in which case there were multiple allocators all being unfair to the receiver. After several rounds, the observer then had to decide how they wanted to proceed with the unfairness. They were able to either punish the allocator or pay to change the rules of the game, which was more of a systemic approach. And you can see kind of the instructions that the participants saw, as well as the decision that they had to make in this slide. So after they played the game, we asked participants questions about the game, such as whether they thought it was fair or unfair, and whose role it was to give money in the game to make sure that they understood what was going on. We also had a manipulation check, which was just to confirm whether they saw that the unfairness was the result of a bad apple or a bad climate. And then we measured blame across the players, including the allocator, the receiver, and the observer, and blame for the game itself through questions like, to what extent is the allocator to blame for the unfair distribution of money in the game? So I actually was able to collect data from 2 pilot studies using money from SICSS. Our first pilot involved about 40 consenting participants, all recruited online through Prolific. The demographics are shown here. But what we found, interestingly, was that most participants incorrectly answered our manipulation check, especially in the bad climate condition. So most people were unable to see unfairness that was the result of a bad climate. Our second pilot also had 40 participants that were recruited on Prolific, but this time we added an incentive to try to encourage participants to correctly identify a bad apple versus a bad climate. We simply ask them, what kind of unfairness did you see? If your answer matches ours, you'll get a bonus. And we found that participants were now able to accurately identify the type of unfairness that they saw. And we did find something that was in our anticipated hypothesis. So participants who saw unfairness that was the result of a bad climate, so a system, were more willing to pay to change the rules of the game, and they also were more likely to blame the game itself, whereas those who saw unfairness as the result of a bad apple were less likely to change the rules of the game and more likely to blame the allocator. So now that I've had some time to collect some pilot data, I want to walk you through what my plans are moving forward. So I've collected actually quite a bit of pilot data. And I'm currently getting ready to launch a full study looking at how people think about injustice, using a US representative sample, also recruited from Prolific. As in my pilot studies, I'm going to be looking at whether there is a main effect of the type of injustice that participants see, so whether they see a bad apple versus a bad climate, on blame for each player, again, the allocator, receiver, or observer, blame for the system, including how much the rules of the game are to blame for the unfairness that they witness, and the desire to change the rules of the game to make it more fair. So my next steps, again, are to collect data from a representative sample. But in addition to that, I want to start thinking about interventions. So we saw that participants were really bad at recognizing unfairness that is the result of more systemic problems. And I want to find a way to get participants to notice that. So whether that's adding incentives or finding different ways to encourage them to be accurate in how they see it, that's something that I want to do moving forward. And I think that this research highlights a lot of different things and is important for several reasons. The first of which is that using an economic game allows us to provide a unique and valuable approach to methodological approach to social science research, and that it helps us strip away any historical context so that we can study complex phenomena like injustice without any pre-existing biases. We're also using real incentives so we can be sure that the way that participants are engaging in the game is how they would engage outside of the game as well. Another really important thing about the economic game that we're designing is that it can help us speak to several social issues at once, because there are plenty of cases described in the media where social issues are the result of both, individuals and a bad system. So we've seen plenty of times, like in financial corruption, it's the results of more than just an individual. Usually it's a whole system that allows it to happen. And it's important because it can also help inform evidence-based interventions that will help people recognize injustice. We're seeing so far that people are bad at seeing bad systems. And so thinking about ways that we can get people to recognize systemic injustice is really important, not only to just help people recognize it, but also in thinking about how we can encourage people to support policies aimed at reducing injustice. But as with any research, I also had some challenges with this. The biggest challenge, again, was getting people to accurately identify our injustice. It seemed like we were able to encourage it a little bit more with our incentive, but we're still having some trouble getting it consistent. So I think that's one thing I want to work on moving forward. And I want to encourage you all watching this video to provide some feedback on ways that you might think we can increase accuracy. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening, and thank SICSS for their support in this research.
Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.